Good morning, everyone, and welcome to those of you who are present here today and those of you who have joined us via webinar. I'm extremely excited about meeting with all of you today to discuss the ongoing issue of acquisition lead time reduction. Over the next hour, I'm going to present part one of a two-part presentation that outlines a strategic approach as to how you can get more contracts awarded faster while utilizing the same number of resources. The methodologies and concepts that I will review with you are counterintuitive, but the results are amazing. I do want to remind you that this presentation has not been endorsed by your organization, but I would encourage you to examine its concepts to determine if it's a good fit for you. Reducing acquisition lead time within the field of contract management has been an ongoing challenge dated back to the mid-1980s. With the effect of tighter budget constraints and increased government oversight, contracting organizations are now focused on streamlining business, acquisition, and governance processes in an effort to reduce acquisition lead time. Failure to develop a plan that provides substantial improvements to reduce lead time will greatly impact contracting organizations and make them susceptible to many risks, such as failure to meet stakeholder or customer expectations, customers seeking alternative procurement methods, additional bottlenecks within the acquisition process, increased procurement costs, utilization of bridge contracts, and many others. The basis of this presentation will show you how you can mitigate or eliminate most of these risks by using methods that systematically exploit your biggest constraints. But before we begin, I would like for you to imagine what life would be like if productivity doubled. Hopefully it doesn't look like this guy. But imagine it's tomorrow morning, you get out of your car and enter your office, and magically productivity has doubled. I mean, you are getting contracts awarded faster, employees are happier, customers are excited about working with you, and you're just on cloud nine. Now, as you ponder that for a moment, I also want you to consider these questions. What will you be able to do that you cannot do now? What would the work environment be like in the office? What would happen if you consistently met customer expectations? How might your organization's reputation change? And how would your life be affected personally? Let's face it, I don't have to tell you the benefits of increased productivity. But what if it happened? Well, today I'm going to show you how it can happen and what you can do tomorrow to see these results in your organization. So let's jump right in. As an overview, we're going to discuss the things you should know to get your organization to the next level and rapidly reduce acquisition lead time. First, we're going to discuss acquisition milestone scheduling, which is one of the most vital areas within the acquisition process. I'm going to uncover the salient challenges of scheduling within a highly complex acquisition environment. Next, we will discuss the root cause of those challenges, because if you don't understand why what you are currently doing isn't working, it's pretty hard to improve. Then I will give you the generic solution, the whole system, nothing held back, so that you are clear on what it takes to reduce acquisition lead time and get contracts awarded faster. We will then discuss how to implement the solutions so that you will know what must be done in order for it to work consistently, effectively, and so you can see results come quickly. The acquisition process by nature is very complex, and every organization is different and has its own unique needs. We will then have time for a 30-minute Q&A session, and then I will wrap things up with my closing remarks. So how do we accomplish reducing lead time? Well, I'm glad you asked. I asked myself this same question as I was conducting research for one of my graduate courses. It was during my course titled Operations Management when I discovered that contracting organizations have very similar characteristics to manufacturing firms, particularly machine and job shops. Although they are totally two different professional fields, I was completely amazed that they have almost identical, highly complex operational processes. They contain very similar constraints. They are very flexible when it comes to creating a product that fits their customers' needs, and in our case, it's in the field of contracts. And the last similarity was that they had almost identical scheduling challenges. After I noticed these distinct similarities within these two polar opposite fields, I knew that the solutions provided were the answer to productivity problems. It was logical, and it made perfect sense. So I devoted my graduate studies to research the unique similarities and differences within each field to determine if the solutions provided could be adapted for a highly complex contracting environment. What I determined is that it boils down to this one critical fact. Our output is dictated by our constraint. In other words, our chain is only as strong as its weakest link. Why is this important? Because our biggest constraint is what prevents us from awarding contracts faster. So what is blocking improvement? What unique factors, if fixed, removed, altered, or somehow adjusted, would allow you to see the substantial improvements? How do we find our biggest constraint? These are the critical questions that shortcut everything. And as one researcher stated, the answer can be the difference between inevitable failure or extraordinary success. So where do we look first? The acquisition milestone schedule. In fact, in my research, I consistently found that the single most powerful point of intervention was scheduling. When you tackle the scheduling monster, you've got it nailed. Scheduling is hard, and with good reason. So let's take a look at what makes scheduling so difficult for contracting organizations. The first challenge is the numerous process and procedures for document approval and compliance reviews. This was the number one issue in my study. With all the federal mandated processes and procedures, it becomes almost impossible to make an accurate acquisition milestone schedule and keep it up to date. Then you have the many variations of contract types and special contracting methods, such as emergency acquisitions. And when you tie the previous two with federal regulations, your chances of awarding a contract on time becomes even smaller. I mean, there are instances within the acquisition process where federal regulations require up to 15 approvals on a document before the procurement process can even begin. The second challenge is the frequent changes in demands of customer requirements. Oftentimes, customers submit ill-defined requirements packages which result in document rework. They frequently want status updates, and at times they even ask for special priority. The third challenge is the lack of technically proficient contracting and technical personnel. This was also a hot item during my studies. During my research, I found supportive information that actually showed a correlation between technical proficiency and the size and type of purchases a contracting professional may procure. My discovery was that most contractual awards are under the simplified acquisition threshold, which require contracting personnel to be more of a tactical purchaser instead of a strategic purchaser. Well, what does this mean? Well, strategic purchasers require advanced technical and business skills that are often lacking in contracting professionals that are tactical purchasers. This would explain why contracting personnel have a hard time asking the appropriate questions to customers to better understand their needs, which ultimately result in poorly written requirements documents. Likewise, technical personnel don't know the necessary information to include in requirements documents and why it is required. So there ends up being a battle of who's responsible for completing which documents rather than a collaborative effort. The fourth challenge is missing or inaccurate data due to system integration challenges. Research suggested that the tracking of irrelevant data was actually quite common, but this practice only added more confusion to the acquisition process and further extended lead time. There were also instances when some systems weren't capturing data at all, and personnel were inputting inaccurate data in systems just so the requirement can be pushed through. The final challenge associated with acquisition milestone scheduling was the lack of quality documents, which caused document rework. This affects all stages of the acquisition process. The frequent rewriting of documents slows down the process, and the requirement becomes in jeopardy of not being awarded on time, which result in expedited reviews, outdated schedules, and increased lead times. So why are these 5 challenges so important? Because they are the sources of variability throughout the acquisition process. They make it difficult, if not impossible, to meet customer expectations, and they lengthen acquisition lead time and increase stress and chaos. Now let's talk about some of the traditional solutions we use to apply to these challenges. Typically, we implement Lean and Six Sigma programs, but because we have so much data, it's hard to get our hands wrapped around the correct data that needs to be measured for improvement. And since the constraints frequently move, it makes it hard to focus on a single area for improvement. Then we add more detail to our processes, which creates even longer lead times. Or we hire additional resources to offset increased workload, which could potentially create an even bigger problem down the road when work requirements decrease, especially since employees are paid per project. When workload decreases, you generally see employee transfers, hiring freezes, but it may also result in forced rifts down the road. While these technical solutions have definitely helped in some respect, they have not produced a substantial impact on developing realistic milestone schedules in an effort to reduce acquisition lead time. So why are traditional solutions reducing acquisition lead time? It's because the typical solutions only address the various symptoms, but they are not addressing the root cause. Well, why are contracting organizations continuing to use traditional methods? Because we are trying to become more efficient. Efficiency has been the gold standard in how we manage and award contract actions, and it's that thought process that hinders us. Dr. Lisa Lang, the theory of constraints consultant and the president of the Science of Business, says that efficiency is not a prerequisite to improvement, it is an effect. This is important because traditional thinking would have one to believe that becoming more efficient involves keeping all resources busy at all times to ensure the highest possible utilization. Our next question is, how are we driven by efficiency? Well, it's in 2 ways. First, it's by balancing capacity or creating a balanced system. Balancing capacity ensures that all available resources are working on some form of available work so that they are at some point in the acquisition process ideally moving closer to a contract award or closeout. The second way we are driven by efficiency is by intuitively increasing work in process. When workload increases, we assign all actions and delegate additional responsibilities to the execution workforce to ensure that they have a project at all times that should be working toward completion. As a result of increasing WIP, resources are not able to complete what they have started in a timely manner. We do all this in the name of efficiency. How are these 2 factors affecting acquisition lead time? Well, let's take a closer look. Let's suppose we have a requirement that has a simple 5-step process before a contract award is made. Initiation is the first step, and it reflects the moment a need is identified by the customer and the time it takes to develop and submit a requirements package to the contracting office. Next, we have the procurement package review, which is the length of time it takes the contracting officer to review the requirements package received from the customer and assign it to the appropriate contracting specialist for procurement processing. The procurement process is the length of time it takes the contract specialist to execute the requirements package for award. Compliance reviews are the required levels of reviews and approvals the proposed contract action must obtain before contract award. And finally, contract award is the date the contract is actually awarded, funding is obligated, and the issuance of the contract to the contractor and the customer. These steps represent the 5 measuring points in the acquisition process. Okay, now let us suppose that a contracting office wants to produce 20 contract awards per day. That means in order to be efficient, each step must have the capacity to complete 20 contractual actions. This is defined as balanced capacity, where each step has the same number of requirements package to be processed for award. All employees are given the capacity to produce what is necessary on a daily basis. Given that 20 is the average number of actions each step must have, a distribution curve can be drawn to determine the probability of getting 20 or more actions out of an individual step. The probability is simply the area under the curve. So there is a 50% chance that one can get 20 or more actions out of any one step. Now let's assume this contracting office had variability of plus or minus 3. Now you must remember, variability are the challenges we identify within the acquisition milestone schedule. That means that the minimum amount of actions that can be processed per step can be 17 on the low end and 23 on the high end. Now this is important. Each step is interdependent of one another, meaning that each step has to be performed sequentially. You can't start with step 3 and then move back to step 1. You will have to start with step 1 and go in order. Interdependency means that once the first step has been established, it determines what the next step can process, meaning that the next step cannot process more than the previous step. It only can process what has been passed to it. Now, the probability of getting 20 or more contract actions is 50% to the 5th power. The exponent is simply the number of steps you have in the system. You can have more or you can have less. I just use 5 for this example. So when you factor in these variables, there is only a 3.13% chance that you can actually get 20 contract actions out of this balanced system. So the system was designed to award 20 contract actions because that is the theoretical capacity. But in reality, it is going to be very difficult given only a 3.13% chance. So why is this percentage so low? It's because of variability, which are the associated challenges with the acquisition milestone schedule and interdependency. If a particular step does not complete the theoretical capacity of 20, it can only pass to the next step, what was completed, minus variability, which consequently reduces the likelihood of awarding 20 contractual actions. So let's make this a little bit more practical. Let's assume that step 1, technical personnel, the customer, did not submit the theoretical capacity of 20 due to variability. Let's say lack of technical proficiency and document rework. He or she was only able to complete and submit 18 requirements packages to the contracting office. That means that step 2 cannot assign more than 18 requirements packages it's received, but it can assign less than 18 packages. So now let's assume step 2, your contracting officers were only capable of reviewing and assigning 15 of the 18 requirements packages due to variability. Let's say the lack of contracting proficiency, the lack of quality documents, and customer changes. Those 15 requirements packages will then be assigned to step 3, contract specialist, which is your execution workforce. Well, step 3 was only able to review and process 12 of the 15 requirements packages due to variability. We would say missing documents, changes to the requirements, and the lack of contracting proficiency. Now, these 12 proposed contract awards can be submitted to Step 4 for compliance review. Step 4, the compliance review team, was capable of reviewing all 12 proposed contract actions and approved them for contract award. Then they submitted them to Step 5. However, assuming that it is nearing the close of business, Step 5, typically your contracting officers, were only able to award and distribute 10 contract awards because they were either in a meeting or a contract specialist had to revise some documents. So now you see that with variability, it is very unlikely that 20 contract actions will be awarded even though the theoretical capacity is 20. Now, my colleague and I actually ran a Monte Carlo simulation 1,000 times with 1,000 outputs and actually confirmed that while the system actually did award 20 more contract actions 3.13% of the time, the average was far less than the desired outcome. This system only averaged 10 contract awards per day. So now you see how a balanced system that was designed to produce 20 contract awards will likely only produce 10 contract awards due to variability. Now, in addition to operating in a balanced system, resources in Step 2 intuitively increase workload and responsibilities for resources in Step 3, also known as work in process, in an effort to maintain efficiency, which further increases acquisition lead time. And they do so with good reason. Some contracting officers hold incredible challenging responsibilities. Not only are they on the front line with customers, the supervisors or managers and policy enforcers, they also have to deal with the challenge of managing multiple personalities and many writing styles of the teams they lead, which can be very frustrating. So knowing they can't do everything, they end up intuitively delegating additional responsibilities to contract specialists just so they can keep abreast of all they are managing, even though it's counterproductive. So they are not to blame. In fact, no one is. There's this big fancy law out there in the scientific world called Little's Law, which is a theorem developed by John Little. And Little was he was an institute professor at MIT, best known for his results in operations research. The law applies to any system, and particularly to systems within systems. This law measures the relationship between work in process, cycle time, and throughput. Well, what does this mean and why is it important? Little's law demonstrates a direct correlation between WIP and lead time. Let's take a look at example 1. This example shows that a product, the blue squares, takes 30 minutes to pass through each process, which gives you a total of 2.5 hours process time. However, when work in process is involved, the gray squares, the time is compounded. Now, since you have 4 actions in the queue, in this example, it would take the 30 minutes process time plus the time it sits in the queue. Hence, a total of 8 hours WIP. And when you total your process time and your WIP stock, you get a total lead time of 10.5 hours. Conversely, in example 3 shows what happens when you have less WIP. Lead time is shorter. It equates to 4.5 hours. This explains why contracts can be awarded faster during slower periods. So what type of WIP is intuitively increased for resources in Step 3? Requirements development functions. My research found that contract specialists generally coordinate with customers for document rework. They are also responsible for the coordination and preparation of contract administration requirements. But the number one item that really impacts lead time is the coordination and preparation of contracting officer pre-award documents such as justification and approval documents, acquisition strategies, and other forms that require a determination made by the contracting officer. Delegating these responsibilities to contract specialists not only increases lead time by preventing contract specialists from focusing on execution, but it directly contributes to the amount of document rework or ill-defined requirements which lead to contract performance issues. It also hinders the most experienced contracting personnel, which are your contracting officers, from providing one-on-one assistance to help better define the requirement and identifying the particular risks associated with it. Typically, contract specialists don't have the business acumen to know the appropriate questions to ask customers to ensure requirements are defined properly. This is generally attributed to the fact that most contract specialists are tactical purchasers and only have the competencies to perform execution functions. So in addition to performing requirements development functions, contract specialists must also maintain their current execution functions, which are preparing and issuing solicitations, creating the actual contract, market research, cost and price analysis, and many other functions. So basically what ends up happening is that your execution workforce becomes a jack of all trades, but a master of none. So what are the effects of high WIP? It reduces the chances of a contract being awarded on time. It makes it harder to predict acquisition milestone schedules. It leads to many inefficiencies, increased document rework, hastiness, risk of employee burnout. It slows the process flow, increases contract administrative changes, results in poor contract execution, and many other inefficiencies. The last thing is that it makes it harder to detect quality defects in documents. Most document defects occur early in the routing of items, but are not detected until compliance reviews or audits. The bottom line is this. There's a cost associated with high WIP, and it's not just increased procurement costs. It costs to lose senior contract specialists because they want to retire earlier due to increased responsibilities. This prevents knowledge transfer, which there's a cost associated with that. It costs when you lose entry-level contract specialists to other organizations or businesses. My research found that some contract specialists actually transfer to other organizations for less pay. Increased responsibilities could be a contributing factor. It costs to have contract specialists to make lateral moves to procurement analyst positions. The fact is, WIP costs money. So when we balance capacity, add variability, and then factor in work in process, it's safe to conclude that we end up with even less contract awards than the average amount of 10 actions that was provided from the Monte Carlo simulation. All these outcomes are driven by efficiency. So what is the solution? The solution is to not focus on efficiency, but rather the focus should be on process flow. Process flow is a focus on the elapsed time from the initial point of the development of a requirement to the time it takes to get it awarded. The two methods that we use to implement and measure process flow is the theory of constraints and drum buffer rule. So what is the theory of constraints? Basically, it helps us to unbalance the system for effective continuous improvement. This is important because focusing resources and time on areas that appear to be the problem may prove to only be a symptom of the underlying issue located within the process. Correcting symptoms will not allow any real significant impact of reducing acquisition lead time. So according to the theory of constraints, these are the steps we take to unbalance a system for continuous improvement. We first must identify the constraint. Then we exploit the constraint by focusing efforts on our weakest link. We then subordinate the system around the constraint to help the critically constrained resource. This is where you identify tasks that can be offloaded to non-constraints and remove excess WIP. Next, we elevate the performance of the constraint by ensuring it is not affected and that it maintains 100% utilization. Then we repeat this process with our next constraint within the acquisition process. So our next method we use to unbalance the system is drum buffer rope. In essence, DBR provides the means to manage the constraint. So the drum is identified as the constraint. And it is the single most important place within the acquisition process that ensures we actually get contracts awarded with minimum disruptions. Now the buffer makes sure that the constraint or the drum will always have enough work to continue operations without overloading it. It's designed to make sure error-free work is available and ready for processing. The rope is a signal generated by the drum indicating that some amount of inventory has been consumed. Basically, the rope helps to manage variability and minimize disruptions to flow. So when you combine these two methods, theory of constraints and drum buffer rope, it helps to control process flow, reduce WIP, manage variability, allow measurements for continuous improvement, and reduce acquisition lead time. So what does implementation look like? Step 1, we unbalance the system by redefining alt. Now, in a balanced system, acquisition lead time is the time between project initiation and contract award. However, in order to effectively manage process flow and implement a system of continuous improvement, we have to redefine alt. Let's assume that it takes a contracting organization a total of 12 weeks to award a contract that is at or below the simplified acquisition threshold. 12 weeks was derived from an organization that generally took 2 weeks or 14 days for their customers to develop a requirements package, obtain certified funds, and send to the contracting office. After the requirements package was received by the contracting office, it generally took another 10 weeks or 70 days to process the requirement at that dollar threshold. This is also taking into consideration all variability in WIP from the point of initiation to contract award. Now keep in mind, the length of time can change. It all depends on the type of requirement being procured. Now as we unbalance the system, alt will now consist of two measurable components: requirements development lead time and procurement acquisition lead time. RDLT is the time between project initiation and when contracting personnel assign a requirements package for processing. PALT is the time between processing or procuring the requirements package and the date of contract award. Step 2 is where we identify the constraint. The theory of constraint suggests that it is where the largest accumulation of WIP is located. It's where process expediters are frequently involved and where special attention is given to ensure orders are completed on time. So now that we know how to identify the constraint, we look for where WIP is increased the most, expediting the queues, which in the contracting environment is typically classified as expedited reviews, and where special attention is given to ensure contracts are awarded on time. Typically, that is the status reporting. Knowing those three variables, we can conclude that step 3 is our constraint. Now, in a balanced system, the constraint often moves around due to variability. However, when we unbalance the system, a constraint is strategically selected as the control point in an effort to control and improve the system. According to John Buffer wrote, the control point or constraint is now identified as the drum because it is the single place that sets the pace of what can actually be awarded in the system. This is the only place where you need to ensure 100% utilization. Now, step 3 is to exploit the constraint. This is where you elevate all assigned actions and responsibilities and purposely reduce WIP. This is a critical step because evaluating actions and defining distinct functional roles will help identify the biggest disruptions to process flow later on when we measure the system for continuous improvement. The benefits of exploiting the constraint is that it will ensure experienced contracting personnel are partnered with stakeholders during the requirements development phase. It will also reinforce business acumen and streamline the necessary competencies within each step of the acquisition process. It will ensure that the execution workforce is only focused on execution and actually processing the requirements for award. And it will create opportunities for effective mentoring, job shadowing, and rotational assignments within each step of the acquisition process to strategically develop additional competencies. This is the most difficult step to implement because it goes against conventional wisdom. But this step is where your improvements will derive. So referring back to our scenario, let's assume we purposely reduce WIP by 25% and only allow resources in step 3 to focus on execution. Now, as you evaluate actions and responsibilities, you determine the percentage of how much WIP should be reduced. This is very important because this is actually where your improvements will come from. So if you reduce WIP less than 25%, you will have less improvements. Likewise, if you reduce WIP more than 25%, your improvements will increase. So assuming that we only decrease WIP by 25%, this will now establish that the most we can get out of this system is 15 minus the variability of step 3. As mentioned, reducing WIP is the hardest step because it goes against conventional wisdom of trying to be efficient. Now, this is where it really gets interesting. Step 4 is where you synchronize the system to support the constraint. Well, how do we do that? By establishing buffers. Buffer 1 will be strategically placed relative to RDLT, or Requirements Development Lead Time, which is toward the end of step 2. This buffer will do two things. It will manage variability and leverage capacity. It manages variability by allowing resources in step 1 and 2 to prepare well-defined requirements documents. This is important because it will reduce the speed of which the actions are assigned to the buffer and ensure they are error-free before they are assigned for procurement processing. It will also allow for technical and contracting personnel to develop specific competencies such as business and interpersonal skills, cross-functional teaming, and provide opportunities to train and educate technical personnel regarding regulations. It will also ensure that all requirements development documents are completed and filed before they are placed in the buffer to be assigned for procurement. This will ensure that the resources in your constraint are not wasting time by deviating from executing error-free requirements. This buffer will also help reduce document rework and the frequent changes customers have by ensuring that resources in Step 2 are resolving these issues before a requirement enters the buffer. And finally, it will help to ensure compliance with regulations. Now, Buffer 1 leverages capacity by not limiting the amount of requirements packages that can be developed between Steps 1 and 2 to ensure the constraint or your drum will not run out of work. However, the buffer will ensure that excess WIP is removed by holding requirements and only releasing enough work to prevent buffer overload. Now, the second buffer will only manage variability relative to PALT by ensuring personnel are trained to gain the appropriate competencies for execution, such as solicitation preparation, negotiating, performing cost and price analysis, market research, writing pre- and post-negotiation memorandums, and etc. These types of trainings will help reduce document rework during this phase in the acquisition process. This buffer will also help reduce contract performance issues by ensuring that execution personnel are complying with regulations by providing training for claim structuring, clause and provision selection, and understanding the different contract types. These efforts will reinforce quality documents and contracts. So what does all of this look like? Well, now that we have unbalanced the system by redefining alt, we've identified the constraint and established that it as the drum to set the pace of what can actually get awarded out of this system. We've exploited the constraint by reducing work in process. Now we add the buffers that support the constraint by managing variability and leveraging capacity. Now, Step 5 elevates the performance of the constraint. This is where we establish our rope that manages the system relative to requirements development lead time. Establishing the rope is critically important because it constrains or limits the amount of work that enters the control point and releases a predetermined size. It manages WIP by ensuring error-free packages are entering and exiting the buffer. It establishes a clear priority system of requirements within the buffer, and it ensures no additional work or responsibilities are assigned to the drum until resources have completely finished a set of predetermined actions. It also tracks disruptions to flow, ensures the appropriate trainings are available and accessible for personnel. It provides status updates to customers and measures for continuous improvement. The rope is the management system. The second rope does the same thing, but just relative to procurement acquisitions lead time, or PALT. It audits contract awards for compliance with regulations, tracks disruptions to flow, ensures appropriate training is provided for contracting personnel, and provides status updates to customers and measures for continuous improvement. So by adding the rope, it helps us to strategically focus on the performance of the constraint by tying the rope from the drum to the first buffer back to the beginning of the process, and from the second buffer to the beginning of the drum. So by unbalancing the system, focusing on process flow, defining functional roles and responsibilities, reducing work in process, and utilizing theory of constraints and drum buffer rope, you are now likely to award 15 contracts in this unbalanced system rather than 10 in a balanced system. which increases output of awarded contracts by 50%. Now, this first improvement alone has actually doubled your productivity. But your second improvement is where it really gets interesting. Since we have purposely reduced WIP by 25% in step 3, PALT is likely to reduce by 25% or by 2.5 weeks, from 10 weeks to 7.5 weeks. However, considering milestone scheduling creep and other variables, 2 weeks reduction is more realistic, which is how I derived at the total PALT time of 8 weeks. Now, if we were to consider this improvement alone and continue awarding just 10 contracts instead of the 15 we were capable of awarding, you will still see an increase of productivity by 25% simply because you are awarding 10 contracts in 10 weeks instead of the original 12 weeks. But when you consider both improvements together, your overall improvement in this system is 87% increased productivity, and your total acquisition lead time has decreased from 12 weeks to 10 weeks. This is how you get more contracts awarded faster utilizing the same number of resources. As I stated earlier, the solution is focusing on process flow rather than efficiency. Listen, I know we have covered a lot today, and you will need some time to digest this information, but if we look at the comparison, we can see that there are more benefits to operating in an unbalanced system focusing on process flow than in a balanced system focusing on efficiency. Guess what? This is only your first major improvement by implementing this unbalanced system. In part 2 of this presentation, I will show you how to measure this system for continuous improvement and see lead time reduced by 40%. From the original 12 weeks lead time down to 7.5 weeks total acquisition lead time. You will be amazed at the improvements you will see all by implementing and measuring this unbalanced system for continuous improvement. It is critical that you partake in part 2 of this presentation so that you may utilize this system to its maximum potential in your efforts of reducing acquisition lead time. Earlier, I had you to imagine what it would be like if productivity doubles and ask you several questions pertaining to your organization, your customers, and how you will be affected personally. Were these any of your answers? Well, I sure hope so. Reduced frustration and stress, increased employee morale, improved communications, a proficient workforce, increased productivity, reduced overtime. Now, this is interesting. How much would you save if overtime is decreased? These are all results of implementing this system. Now, are you wondering how this will work within your current contracting processes or with your organizational structure? What about getting buy-in from your team? Well, if you are asking yourself any of these questions, then I am really excited for you. That means you are already thinking through the process. The key is customization. We have to look at the unique strengths and weaknesses of your organization to determine the best fit. Here are some things to consider. Issuing warrants for site authority. Maybe developing a separate team that only handles requirement development functions. The establishment of a senior contract specialist team may relieve the contracting officer of some of his or her duties, such as only handling the requirements development functions. How does knowledge transfer and succession planning play into all of this? Would you consider running a pilot program? These are just some of the things to consider and think through. Today, we have discussed the strategic approach to getting your contracting organization to the next level and rapidly reduce lead time. We discussed 4 key areas: the salient challenges of acquisition milestone scheduling, the root cause of those challenges, a generic solution, and how you can implement this for your organization to start seeing improvements tomorrow. Now I'd like to open the floor up for questions. If there are no questions, I'd like to leave you with this. I've presented some great ideas and very interesting concepts and methodologies today. The ideas are just that until they are implemented. But these risks that you see here on the screen are very real and are not to be taken lightly. Before we depart, I would like to ask you this. Are you willing to risk mission failure by not doing anything? Will you be able to sleep at night knowing that your execution workforce is on the brink of either retiring or looking for another organization to work for? What about the countless number of lives that are depending on you to process actions quickly? What are you willing to lose before you take action? If you do nothing, these risks will eventually become a reality. Thank you.